Good evening, and welcome to the fourth panel in our series, Journalism, Politics, and the 2020 Election. My name is Nicole Dahmen, and I'm an associate professor at the School of Journalism and Communication at the University of Oregon, and I am the host for this series. These conversations feature our faculty experts discussing key issues related to news, politics, and this historic period that we're all living through. From sports and social activism to race and gender, and to our conversation this evening about shared connections across rural and local communities. We've designed this series for our School of Journalism and Communication students, as well as the UO community and people across this state. We're going to first turn for our panelists for a moderated discussion, and we hope that you'll use the Q&A feature in Zoom to share any questions you may have. We will then read audience questions at 5:45. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our SOJC YouTube channel. Our moderator for this series is Professor Seth Lewis. Professor Lewis is the founding holder of the Shirley Papay Chair in Emerging Media in the School of Journalism and Communication. He's a fellow with Columbia University, an affiliate fellow with Yale Law School, and a recent visiting fellow at the University of Oxford. He's also the director of the journalism sequence at the SOJC. Our three panelists this evening are Lisa Heyamoto, who is a senior instructor of journalism at the University of Oregon, and she's a senior programming manager at Lion Publishers, a nonprofit that supports local, independent journalism organizations. Her work centers on increasing news access for underserved areas and building public trust in journalism, particularly through people-centered journalism and community engagement. With 2 decades of experience in newsrooms, classrooms, and boardrooms, she's committed to channeling the best of journalism's past toward a relevant and resilient future. Todd Milbourn is an investigative reporter, journalism instructor, and director of the SOJC's Journalism Master's Program. As an Agora Faculty Innovation Fellow, Milbourn co-founded the 32% Project, a national community engagement project exploring what drives and disrupts trust in the news media. Before joining the University of Oregon, he worked as a newspaper reporter for the Sacramento Bee and the Modesto Bee, where he produced a string of award-winning investigations. He's also worked as a magazine editor in Prague and as a broadcast journalist for the CBS affiliate in Eugene. Our final panelist this evening is Damian Radcliffe. Damien is the Carolyn Chambers Professor of Journalism at the SOJC. He's also a fellow of the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia, an honorary research fellow at Cardiff University, and a fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufacturers, and Commerce. He's an experienced digital analyst, consultant, journalist, and researcher, and he's worked in editorial, research, policy, and teaching positions for the past 2 decades in the UK, Middle East, and the USA. And he has a specialization in hyperlocal media. Seth?
Great, thank you, Nicole, and thank you all for joining us again for the webinar series. We've had a number of great conversations, and this fourth installment promises to be another good discussion about some very important issues. So tonight we're focusing in part on this tension, the so-called tension that exists between rural and urban in America. We've heard a lot about this over the years, and there's lots to discuss about the role that journalism can play in facilitating stronger connections between rural and urban, as well as leading toward greater trust and so forth. So I'd like to each of the panelists to talk about this question, although I'll give it to you first, Todd, to kind of help us understand what essentially are people talking about when they discuss this so-called rural-urban divide. What sort of dynamics are in play, and what does journalism have to do with this?
Well, I think a lot of it focuses on who has access to quality information to know what's going on in their communities. And if you look, the University of North Carolina collects data on news deserts across the country. And these are counties that have either 1 or 0 dedicated news outlet that serves and provides that community with information. And if you look across the state of Oregon, for example, there are 36 counties in Oregon. We have 15 counties that only have 1 newspaper for the entire county, and 2 counties, Wheeler and Sherman, that have no newspapers or news outlets serving them at all. And so that has really important impacts when it comes to not just understanding what's going on in a local community, but it also contributes to sort of a growing nationalization of politics when people end up turning to Facebook or cable news as ways to fill that gap. So I think, when I think about this question, I think about what an abundance of information overload we often have at the national level. But when we drill down and get to local communities, I think there's a real and growing scarcity.
Great, thanks, Todd. Lisa, and then Damien, what are your thoughts about just kind of this overall tension, as well as some of the challenges, and perhaps also we can begin to point to some of the opportunities at this intersection of rural and urban?
Absolutely. I think Todd really nailed it when he talked about news and information access. I think that there is a huge divide when it comes to who has access to that information in a way that really affects their lives, information that they can really sort of see as relevant to what they're doing, or they can see sort of their lives reflected back on them. And the reality is just these news deserts emerge first in rural areas. And what we've ended up with, as there have been these closures of these news organizations and not a lot to take its place, although there are organizations taking that place, which I'd love to talk about later. But as we see that, we start to see that news and information is being overserved to overserved populations, and underserved or not served at all to those who are without. And that is a really big concern because, first of all, everybody deserves information to help them learn about the world around them in a way that affects them and helps them make the decisions they need to make. But second of all, that becomes a real equity issue. Some people shouldn't have less information than others, and it leads to a lot of sort of trickle down effects. For example, organizations that don't have a dedicated news source tend to have less civic engagement, lower voter turnout. There tends to be less responsible spending by government agencies. And as we've seen lately, sort of a lot of misunderstandings even within communities about who's in those communities and what binds them.
I would agree with everything that Todd and Lisa have said in terms of those impacts, the importance of having access to accurate, fresh information that is produced within a community rather than outside of it. I think that's incredibly important. And Todd's talked about newspapers and some of Penny Abernathy's invaluable research from the University of North Carolina. Across the US, we know that 200 counties have no newspaper. Around about half, over 1,500 of them only have one, and that tends to be a weekly. One of the themes that came up right in the first session was about the speeding up of the news cycle. In the first webinar, Brent Wolf made a number of really good points about that. So, given that the news cycle is speeding up and rural communities are potentially more detached from that because of some of the structural challenges they face with how their news is created and distributed, that has real knock-on effects along the lines that Lisa has just described. And it's worth saying, we're talking a lot already about newspapers, and it's not just because Todd and Lisa come from a newspaper background and we, as journalism professors, we love newspapers. There's plenty of research that also shows that, particularly at a local level, newspapers are still responsible for the vast majority of original reporting, investigative work, but also other content that is incredibly valuable in terms of telling the story of a community and reflecting it back unto itself. The watchdogs and the poodles is one of my friends who used to work for Gannett described it. That really matters, and those stories so often are then picked up by local TV, by digital only outlets. They're the ones that rise up the ecosystem and are picked up by metro papers, by national papers, and other kind of national outlets. So when we talk about the importance of newspapers in this space, I don't think it can be overstated because it is still the primary source of original reporting, and still a key way in which many audiences, particularly older audiences who are less digitally engaged, still understand and get their reflection and understanding of the world around them.
So we're talking about, there's a lot of great things here we want to kind of dive into. I think one of those is, it sounds like we have this vastly and rapidly shrinking reservoir of original content creation, original news creation that now is kind of leading to these deserts in different parts of the country, primarily very rural parts of the country. But there are also ways in which these same dynamics are affecting news in cities, right, in metropolitan areas, and in communities that are suburban, right? So it's not just about rural counties. I wonder if we could talk a bit about some of those dynamics of urban and local, in addition to in addition to rural per se. And then I want to come back to this question that Lisa brought up about how people feel seen or feel heard in the news, because this is not necessarily just a function now of newspapers disappearing, right? This has been an ongoing problem for decades. So maybe first let's take up this question of kind of more fully parsing out the nature of news and the challenges that face news in different types of localities. And then also making sure we kind of fully come back to addressing this question of how people feel seen or unseen, depending on how news is portrayed. Maybe Lisa, do you want to take this one up first?
Yeah. Say it for me again, though, because my mind buzzing.
That was a very big question. It was a multi-part question. Well, let's go first to what you were describing in terms of how people, how the news has been successful or less successful in allowing people to feel seen and heard in coverage. I know this is something that you've studied in your research, and I'm curious if you can maybe talk about kind of what we know from the past about how people feel included in the news and what that might mean for, how does that become compounded by the current problems we're seeing as, newspapers and others fade amidst the challenge for the business model that we talked about?
Sure. I mean, I think there are a couple of things to dive into. The first is that, if you have a lot of coverage of an area, the chances are better that more stories are going to be told that are relevant to more people, right? That information is going to be more meaningful to more people, although that's not always the case, right? Traditionally, journalism has covered portions of our society much more than others. And I think that there are many folks in this country who have never really been served very well by journalism. And we're having that conversation in a really meaningful way now, finally, which is wonderful. I think that news deserts exist not just in rural areas, as I believe it was Todd that pointed out, but I think it's really important for people to see their lives reflected in the media they consume. I think it helps them have information they need to make choices. Oh, who are the candidates running in my local election, or what is my county government up to, or my utilities board, those sort of traditional functions of journalism. But I think there's a sort of a psychological function of journalism that is very, very important here, which is seeing your life reflected back at you. It sort of validates your existence in a way, right? I think often about a story that I read in one of our local news organizations, and it was just about how picking up and dropping off your kid at school was just a terrible experience. The traffic was bad, your kid feels like they might get run over by a car, parents are frustrated, kids are late. There wasn't really anything to it except for I felt so seen because that is my experience every single day. And to see it reflected back at me made me feel like, yeah, like my experience is terrible. Other people think that maybe something will happen about it. And I felt great in a really odd way. And I think that, in my and Todd's research, talking to people who have been very underserved in the past by journalism, they were talking about sort of the narrative that emerges in a place, right? Where, we've seen lots of examples of narratives that emerge that are very damaging, that are very dangerous. Let's say it's a community where only crime is being covered. And so it just seems like it's this very dangerous place and there's nothing good that happens and everything is awful all the time. But then that becomes the narrative of the place, and then that becomes sort of the narrative of the people. And it's not the whole story. And I think, yeah, there's something really kind of psychologically damaging there. And when we have these news organizations who are reflecting that community, who are producing information that people can see themselves in, that creates a much more realistic narrative. That was a long answer, but.
No, it was a great answer too. An initially very long question, but it's fantastic. Thank you, Lisa. Todd, do you have anything to add on this, or Damien as well?
Yeah, I do. I mean, part of our research was we visited urban communities and we visited, farming communities and communities in between. And I was struck by a comment we heard when we were having a workshop at a diner in Vienna, Illinois, which is this small farming community, about 7,000 people, close to the southern border of Illinois. And one woman remarked in our conversation, she said, anytime we're portrayed, people from our community are portrayed in the media, we're either Bible thumpers or bumpkins, is what she said. And there was a similar version of that in other communities as well, right? And I think it stems from that sense that Lisa's talking about not authentically being portrayed in communities, right? I think there's portrayal, but then there's also authentic portrayal. And does that actually capture the reality? And I think there's another, if I can add on to that too, another kind of dynamic I think that plays out when you have pullback from rural communities is, yeah, there are fewer stories capturing what's going on, but at the same time, there are fewer journalists. And so if you live in Vienna, Illinois, there was a time when there was a thriving 2 newspapers and you would go and bump into a columnist at the grocery store, or you'd see the editor at church, right? And you had these kind of less formal connections and saw journalists as members of your community, raising kids and trying to do things right. And I think in the absence of that and the sort of nationalization of our conversation around politics, around journalism, there's something I think really important lost there. And I think that has real implications for how the press is seen generally across the country.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there are issues of portrayal at both a national and a local level, that even at a local level, many outlets could arguably be accused of having kind of super served existing audiences. There are really interesting questions, say around print. To what extent are newspapers covering areas that they do not distribute to? And actually, there's often a correlation kind of between that and large constituents who feel completely disenfranchised from media that is in their area, never mind media that is being produced on the east or western seaboards. And that's another issue which I'm sure we'll talk about. So there's definitely kind of big portrayal issues there. And to that point of sort of being seen and the knock-on effect of that, I think that's really important when we look at wider trends around trust in journalism, understanding about what journalism is and what it does, and the fake news agenda. If I think back to when I was young, more years ago than I probably care to admit, pretty much any public event I remember going to as a kid, there was always a reporter there and a photographer. And that was my kind of first exposure to journalism. And I thought it was pretty cool. And you could go and talk to them. And it was made the local paper very approachable. Similarly, I lived in small towns where the paper was on Main Street and you could walk in and request, you could buy a copy, you could get stuff from the archives, you could probably get to talk to reporters. There was a level of accessibility that I think has a natural conduit through to levels of trust. Now, I wrote a piece a couple of years ago where I said, it's much harder to argue something is fake news if you're bumping into that journalist at the school gates. And I really think that's true.
So I want to pick up on that question of trust, because I think it's something that I think all of you have touched on to some degree. So clearly there is a degree to which the fact that the news is less visible, it's less approachable, journalists are less approachable, less available, et cetera, that has something to do with the way people then have maybe challenges in trusting the news. And of course, as Todd mentioned, this nationalization of news and politics, where so much energy and oxygen goes to the national level and so little of it goes to the local level, ends up leading to kind of this hyperpolarized orientation around politics as well as news, because the two are so interlinked. I wonder if you could, perhaps Todd and Lisa and others can kind of talk about what are some other dynamics that play into a kind of disconnection here between journalists and the communities they cover, whether large or small, when it comes to this issue of trust. So what seems to be going, what is sort of gone poorly in terms of leading to mistrust and distrust? And also let's kind of also look toward more positively, what, if anything, can journalists begin to do, or can people begin to do to begin to reclaim a greater sense of mutual trust?
I'm happy to kick off on that if I
Sure, go
may.
ahead.
I mean, I think part of the challenge is not just the nationalization of politics that you described, but also the nationalization of journalism. So there was data published in 2014 and then republished in 2019, which said 1 in 5 of all journalism jobs, and this is pre-pandemic, so the figure is probably very different now, but at that point, 1 in 5 of all journalism jobs could be found in 3 cities, LA, New York, and Washington, DC. Go back to 2004, and it was 1 in 8. So within the space of a decade, the number of jobs that were not on the 2 seaboards has halved. And that has had, inevitable consequences for issues of trust and visibility and some of the things that we've talked upon about. It's also led to a lot of very essentially poor reporting that has been done essentially by journalists parachuting in to communities, telling stories, which are not necessarily accurate or detailed, getting these kind of like snapshots of what's going on and then disappearing again. There was a piece I read over the weekend talking about, essentially, let's please not have another story about Trump reporters in a diner. Like, journalists, please up your game. There are other places in which you can have these conversations, but also, let's think about the language we use. So when journalists talk about flyover states and other such things, that's incredibly insulting language for those communities in Middle America. And we also, must try and, in terms of solutions, which I know you want to talk more about, think about there are still lots of great journalists doing great journalism outside of the East and West Coast. And we need to see more partnerships with those organizations. We need to see a greater elevation of those stories. And we need to avoid efforts which are often designed with good intentions, but are poorly executed. So a classic example in 2016, just after the election, was that Reuters appointed a Rust Belt editor, a reporter, who was going to go around and visit Ohio and other places because they said, oh, we got this wrong during the election and we need to remedy this. So, but the solution was to take someone from the East Coast and transplant them into the Rust Belt, rather than saying, who are the journalists that are already there? Who are the journalists who might have been laid off or furloughed or could just work in partnership with their existing operation to tell those stories, and we as Reuters can put our voice behind that to elevate it. So the intention was good, but the execution was poor and misguided.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I see that. I really appreciate what you're saying there, Damien. And I see so many wonderful opportunities to kind of shift the sort of job market model that I think has long existed in journalism, especially in broadcast journalism, where somebody goes to college, learns the technical skills to be a journalist, and then goes to a small market, works for 2 years, moves up to another market, and after a game of hopscotch in a few years, you're in a sort of destination urban area you might have originally saw yourself in. And I think that's been to a lesser extent in newspapers, but I think that's been pretty standard practice across the news landscape. And so, to underscore what Damian's talking about, I'm really heartened by models I'm seeing out there at the Texas Tribune. There's a new startup in West Virginia called the Mountain State Spotlight. ProPublica is expanding its hiring into the Midwest, and all of those organizations are not looking to import talent and skills from elsewhere. They're looking to build it up from the ground. And I think that is a pathway to trust, because it helps you better tell the story of that community, to have that perspective and those roots. And it helps, I think, to tell that story more authentically. So I always encourage my students, who are looking for jobs and opportunities, like, what's going on back home?
I'll just quickly add on a couple of things. There are 3 sort of really hopeful trends that I've observed, in addition to what Todd and Damien have laid out. But yeah, just to piggyback on Todd, a real a real sort of premium on geographic expertise, on understanding an area that is being valued in journalism much more than I think it ever has in the past. And that gives me hope that we can really, people who are of these communities and are invested in these communities can do great journalism for these communities. Another is that this conversation about journalism and trust has really inspired a big reckoning in the journalism industry about who we've served, who we haven't served, and how. And I think you're seeing a real sea change in terms of how journalists and journalism organizations are thinking about trust. And they're putting it much more at the center of the work they do. They're understanding that trust needs to be earned. It's not something that you are given, and you have to earn it over and over and over again. And the way you do that is to be really authentically engaged in your community and think about those you serve as someone that you serve with good information. And then finally, my last big hope, which is maybe the one silver lining of the COVID-19 crisis, is the work from home shift. As many of us work from home, and many entire sort of workplaces and industries have now baked this into how folks work in a way that's going to carry into the future, I think the opportunities are much more robust for people who, maybe they report for a national organization, but from, a community that they love, or maybe they start something new in that community while they kind of hold down another work from home job, or maybe they're able to reach their community in a new way because of, these new sort of avenues of technology that we're now so familiar with. I do think that there's a lot of really promising movement there, and it makes me excited.
Yeah, I definitely want to hear more about possible solutions, either emergent ones or ones that are kind of hopeful on the horizon, as well as some of the more concerning effects that have come out of the news desert phenomenon. So, for example, the team at UNC Chapel Hill that tracks news deserts also has been looking at what they call ghost newspapers, where essentially there is a newspaper and it's functioning, but the staff is so thoroughly depleted, the news production and the quality has been so thoroughly diminished that it's really not the same thing. And so even though a paper exists in a given area and there is journalism being produced, it's just at such a poor and smaller level that it's hard to even say that counts really for what used to be there. And another thing that has been highlighted recently in some New York Times reporting is how in parts of the country where there are news deserts, as well as just in many other communities as well, we have kind of the profusion of lots of different little sites that are news-like in presentation and yet are sort of astroturf type sites, right? They're not grassroots, but they're kind of corporate sponsor and paid for by political parties or candidates. Can you talk a bit about sort of what we're seeing kind of emerge in the gap that exists now in places where there is less news being produced by professional journalists?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're seeing actors taking advantage of vulnerable communities in many ways, right? And you think about a robust journalism organization should be, help protect against, some bad actors kind of entering your community. But, I think about this a lot. I think a lot of what's going on in local journalism maps onto broader problems that we're facing and inequalities in our society, right? Seth and I were talking about an article from Milbourn Lab several years ago about the unbanked and looking at small town America and how payday lenders are charging 36% on loans. Egregious. But you don't have larger banks, often consolidated on the coasts, feeling that it's worth their time and interest and at that scale to serve those communities. So other actors are stepping in. And I think that's what we're seeing with a lot of the proliferation of these small sites that are popping up. All over the country, including right here in Lane County, that have kind of factory created content with a political agenda behind it. There's a vacuum there. And I think that we understand that a vacuum is going to be filled. I think the question for us as a democracy is who's going to fill that and who's going to support it.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing a lot of opportunistic efforts, really kind of blurring the lines between content that looks like news but isn't news, often supported by political parties. And we've talked about already in this series earlier, the flattening of news and the challenge of discerning fact from fiction and of discerning biases when all the news looks the same. And that's very much the case, in this space. What researchers at the Tao Center at Columbia have referred to as pink slime sites. And I think we're only going to see, more of those emerge because they recognize that these are communities where there is a void, where people are still seeking news and information. They're having to find it in different places. And often that's Facebook groups, or it's next door, or it's through email chains that they're having with their friends, and so forth. And so, they are opportunistically moving into this space and potentially creating a misinformation ecosystem with nobody to offer a counter narrative or to fact check or to push back. And so many of the visual cues that we used to historically get from our journalism have just become absent and redundant in the digital age. So yeah, that is a huge issue. And of course, even where we do have outlets, as we've talked about, many of them have been hollowed out. So we're seeing a lot more wire copy. We're seeing a lot more press releases essentially kind of redressed as reporting, or we're seeing reporting which is still original, but where there are fewer sources and where the default sources and people who are being interviewed tend to be old white men, people in positions of authority, and those communities that Lisa in particular has talked so eloquently about, who haven't seen themselves seen and represented, are being seeing even more of that right now. And that trend line is only going to increase unless we start to do something differently.
So I wonder, maybe Lisa, you could talk a bit about some of the projects that you're seeing beginning to emerge through your role this year, working with Lion publishers. And I know that you're closer to the ground right now in terms of seeing various startups and other kind of upstart initiatives to improve the types of journalism that's being produced in smaller kind of micro ways. And could you tell us a bit about that and maybe how that can point to some more positive developments that may be on the horizon?
Absolutely. We're seeing a lot of movement in trying to address these news deserts, or trying to address these sort of ghost newspaper towns, trying to increase news and information access. And it's a long, hard road. A lot of times these are individual folks or folks who are working in a team who some of them have journalism experience, some of them don't. They see a need and they want to help. And they're saying, okay, I see this unserved community, or I see this unmet need. I'm going to make a thing that meets it. And you're seeing a lot of action around newsletters, where folks are just gathering news on their own and sending it out via email to folks. Podcasts, certainly. And of course, digital only sites. And, there's a lot of really great journalism that's being produced at these places, just really exactly what we've been talking about, which is people who are of these communities, who understand, who are invested and are gathering the information that isn't being gathered and sharing the information that isn't being shared. The problem is that there's not a strong infrastructure for this yet. So, these folks are kind of spackling it together, trying to make it work, sometimes working other jobs. And what we're starting to see in the in the news industry is efforts to build some sort of an infrastructure, because there's no one thing that's working better than anything else. So there's no real best practices yet. We're really in a figuring it out phase. And it's messy and it's hard work, but it's worth it.
So I want to hear you talk. All of you have touched on this to some extent or another, but I feel like, and I'm sure you know this experience, where people ask you, well, how can I know what I can actually trust out there? There's so many sources, there's so much information, there's so much noise, it seems. And even within journalism, right? We know there's different types of levels of quality and so forth. But when it comes to this question of trust, so we know from surveys that even the people say they have, less than half of people trust even the news they get on a regular basis, which should be very concerning to us. So what would you tell people who are quite skeptical, who feel they can't trust news all that much? What would you tell them about kind of the state of affairs currently, and maybe in terms of what's happening with local journalism in their communities here in the Pacific Northwest, or just what they should know about journalism more generally when it comes to what can I trust? Any thoughts on kind of what sort of go-to advice you would convey to people who may be feeling that way?
I would say bring that skepticism. I think that's a great place to start when you're thinking about how to engage with information. Now, don't let that tip into cynicism, but I think there's a real sweet spot there. We should be thinking critically about the information we get. One piece of advice I sometimes give is for people to be really deliberate about their news choices. Think about it like you're buying, let's say, a new dishwasher. You're going to go look at Consumer Reports. You're going to comparison shop. You're going to think about like who are these brands? What's their, how have they been reviewed, right? I think so few of us take the time to do that when it comes to the news and information that shapes our understanding of the world. So spend a lot of time on those About Us pages, right? Get to understand who this organization is. Follow the money. Think about what is funding and who is funding this organization and what their agenda may or may not be, and make an investment in it. If you are paying $8.99 a month for a digital subscription, you have made a conscious choice, and I think you're going to consume that media in a way that's just much more deliberate than we do on so often on social, where news about what's happening in politics is right up there against cat videos and a picture from mom.
For me, I offer two sort of additional thoughts to that. I mean, the first thing is I think it is incumbent on newsrooms to do a better job. And, in terms of being more visible, broadening the range of sources, changing the narrative. So we haven't talked about solutions journalism yet, but we should, about portraying communities differently and in all of their complexity and nuances. I think that is incredibly important. We need to talk more as journalists about the process of how we put together the news. What's the stuff that ends up on the cutting room floor, and why? Why are we telling this story on page 1 and the story that you think should be the lead is actually on page 7, or we haven't covered it at all? We need to do much more of that work to sort of build a more news literate audience, and in the process encourage the inquisitiveness and constructive criticism that Todd outlined earlier. Alongside that, to audiences, I also think that there are so many opportunities now with these models, and Lisa's touched on a few of those, from kind of newsletters to podcasts to Facebook groups to WordPress sites to so many others, that if you see gaps with the kinds of stories that you want to see in your community not being covered, go out and cover them. The means to report that and to distribute it and publish it has never been easier. And one of the things that we certainly saw after the 2009 Great Recession was this emergence of more hyperlocal media outlets and people being entrepreneurial in this space. And some of that in some cases, that was journalists who had been laid off, who were trying to sort of pivot into creating their own products and turning that into a business. But in many cases, they were active citizens, concerned citizens, who were doing this as a hobby, if you like. They were doing this in the evenings and weekends because they recognized it was really, really important for their communities to have access to accurate news and information, and they stepped up. And those people wouldn't necessarily think of themselves as journalists, and I think those people who do see themselves as journalists, or people who are journalists, should not be snobby at all about people who are producing this work. And in fact, what we should be doing is saying, how can we work with you? How can we train you? How can we take your story and byline you? How can we pay you for this content? How can we drive traffic back to your newsletter, your WordPress site, and so forth? No single organization is going to do this alone. A multi-stakeholder approach is the only way in which we're going to move the needle. And that's going to require a wide range of different types of organizations working together, from funders to content creators, from different sectors. And it's only by working collaboratively and collectively can we really move forward.
I'll add that the big takeaway from our research into trust is that people trust journalism organizations for the same reason they trust people. And they distrust them for the same reason. So if you if you think about like a journalism organization as a friend, which I would love it if you would, because a journalism organization should feel intimate and close and useful like a friend would. But if you think about, maybe you've got a friend who is always like telling you something cool you didn't know about, right? Or broadening the way you thought about something, or giving you information you didn't have before. And they're doing it in a way that is accessible, that helps you understand the world better, and makes you think about your own life. That's a great friend. But if you've got a friend who, for example, is only telling you the most depressing news all the time, right? They're just a real Debbie Downer, and they're always just like, oh yeah, the world's terrible. That's a difficult relationship. Or if you've got a friend who's just mad all the time and is always mad and is talking about things that make them mad and make you mad, or they're telling you information that just really feels one-sided, or they're giving you information that you know is not true, or they're giving you information that you know is not the whole story. You don't trust that person, but you intuitively know when that's happening. And if we sort of apply these same rules to good journalism organizations, then we start to develop a relationship with them, and they should be developing a relationship with us as well. So the friend metaphor, I think, is a good way to think about where you're getting your information. What kind of friend are they? What kind of friend are you?
Yeah, and I think one thing like a good friend does is serves you with the information that you need in the moment, right? And I think this goes back to something that Lisa was talking about here, which is this idea of serving community information needs. And I think that is something that it transcends all communities, right? And it's going to be different in different places at different times, right? And I think, as journalism educators and practitioners wrestle with this, I think a lot of times we're like, what's the story? And that might not be what the community needs at that moment. They might not need a story, but they might need information about, what the situation with the water in their community. And so I think we need to, I think the language that we often use around what are we going to cover, what's the story? I think if we replace that with what information does my audience need, what does my community need right now, I think that's going to help us get closer to trust if we really use that as our North Star.
Well, and the great thing is there's academic research that backs that up. There's research that shows that audiences, particularly at a local level, value the kind of friend role that journalism can play above watchdog reporting. They actually want to see their kids in picture in the paper. They want to know that I can go into the archives and I can pull out this story of something that happened to my grandfather 50 years ago and so forth. That this is, we often talk about journalism as the first draft of history. Well, at a local level, that's absolutely true, and in many cases it is the repository of that history. That's where we go to is local media archives. So the friend analogy is one that 100% resonates with me, and with all of our best friends we can also be slightly critical if we need to be, and kind of pull them up, and that's the kind of relationship that people should be having with journalists and local newsrooms too.
Great, excellent, wonderful comments. This is a good maybe segue point to go to see what people have to ask our panelists who've been listening tonight.
Great. So we have a number of good questions that have come in from the Q&A, and I've also gotten some questions in my email this evening. So we spent a lot of time talking about the lack of trust from the public in regard to journalism. Can you all just give us a little bit of background and sort of context? When did the public lose trust in journalism? Why? And then bringing this back to the election, how has that been politically exploited in the past, say, 4, 5, 6 years?
Well, I can try to set the stage with, this a little bit here. And it certainly is a decades-long trend. And we've seen trust in our civic institutions generally, whether that's government, whether that's religious institutions, schools, has been in a steady decline for about the last 50 or 60 years, right? And so journalism, I think, has been on the leading edge of that. It is not trusted as poorly as Congress, but you know, you know, and I think there have been a number of things, you know, that have certainly been driving that. Certainly, technology has played a key role. I think certainly part of you know, broader kind of inequality rising in the country has changed that. You know, but we're at a point where after the 2016 election, the latest figures in trust were about 32% of Americans said that they had at least some measure of trust in news organizations. That has since climbed upward slightly, which is heartening. And I think, you know, there certainly has been a lot of exploitation of that trust, but I think one positive thing we're seeing right now in this moment is, I think, a new or maybe refound appreciation for the role that journalists play in communities, a real kind of resurgent interest in sort of journalism as a field and what that means for a democracy. So, you know, it's been we've been a long time coming getting to this point.
I'd just like to quickly add that, you know, I think it's not quite the right. I hear a lot of talk about sort of the golden age of journalism and how that was sort of the golden age of trust, and like, if only we could get back to that. And I always come back to the question of, well, the golden age for who? Was it ever really a golden age? And I was having this discussion with some folks this morning. I think that we've yet to reach the golden age of journalism, and I don't think we can reach it until we've had the very hard conversations that we've been having. Who do we serve? Why them? Is that everybody? How are we doing it? How are we meeting people where they are with the information they need? And we're not there yet, but we can't get there until we recognize who we've left out.
And to that point, you know, we also have to have a conversation about who needs to be in newsrooms telling these stories that is not there. There are massive, massive diversity issues within newsrooms, you know, across the country. But I think particularly once you get out of many of the larger metropolitan areas, just, you know, as a throw to some research that I'll have coming out later this year, I did a survey of local newspapers, small local newspapers across the states. And granted, it's a self-selecting group of respondents, but 90% of people who replied identified their ethnicity as white. And, you know, that some of the respondents pointed out that that actually reflects the communities that they are in, but for many others, that is not the case. And people were openly admitting, we really struggle to reach and engage with communities that do not look like us. We cannot necessarily attract the right people into our newsroom to tell those stories, or the people with the right skills. So when we look at successes, I mean, one great example to look at is the work that's been done by Report for America, and the work that they have been doing in terms of leveraging funding from a wide variety of different sources, going into small, mostly rural newsrooms and helping to plug coverage gaps, particularly in terms of Latinx communities, but, you know, but among many others. And then once that funding for that role disappears, so too in many cases does the coverage of that beat and of those communities, even though it's proven to be successful, proof that there is an audience for that, prove that it adds value. But the question is, for many of those newsrooms, how do I find a journalist with the skills that we need, particularly often in many cases, you know, it's language skills, to be able to go in and tell those stories? How do we make working in a rural newsroom as attractive as working in a metropolitan area or a larger city? And, you know, that is a really big systemic issue that we have to address.
So One of the questions that was emailed in is talking about so much of the political coverage that we see is driven by, campaign talking points, or it's driven by tweets, right? Or something sort of outlandish that happened on the campaign trail. How can journalists really involve the public in steering and guiding and framing political news, especially when it comes to local elections and local communities?
Hmm. Yeah, I think journalists in news organizations could start by stopping to, they often situate their coverage in between the campaigns, and how are we covering the campaigns versus how are we getting questions answered for our audience, right? And so I think that's where the emphasis needs to be placed. And I think there's some really exciting experiments around this. One that I've paid a lot of attention to is the Human Voter Guide from Southern California Public Radio. And they take questions from their community, and, it's often they don't receive questions about, a very specific platform or talking point for a politician, but it's like, where's my polling place? What do I do with my ballot? Can I trust this source of information about the election, right? So it kind of opens up that conversation around politics, which I think is really important. I think, situating journalism in between campaigns makes journalism often read like sports coverage: who's up, who's down, who's winning, who's losing. And I think that leaves a lot of people who would want to know more about what's going on in politics feeling like they're out of that conversation. And I think that needs to change.
For me also, I mean, the key thing you said there, Todd, was this is about the questions that are asked, and the questions that communities want answered are not necessarily the same questions that people in the newsroom want to answer. So there are really important questions around the way we operate as journalists. How do we hand more control back to the audience? Who are we there to serve? What can we learn from communities that do this well? So, how do we, how does a newspaper become the core of its community? Or what do you learn from, from Reddit or other platforms where you see really engaged communities having discussions and determining kind of what's of value to them, and that's what drives a conversation forward. I think we need to be doing, a lot more of that. And the other thing we also have to recognize is that, not just that we often report on politics in particular, very much exactly as you described, as like, who's up, who's down, who's winning. This is not sports, but we also assume audiences are following us every step of the way on the story that we are reporting, and they are not. They are coming in at different points, and yet the explanatory context is so often missing. We just assume that that audiences have followed every single public meeting on this zoning issue, and that therefore we don't need to provide the background, and that's just not the case. So we need to understand more about not just what audiences want answered, but also how our audience is behaving, and modify what we offer them to reflect that.
So Lisa, let me come to you with this next question. And there's a couple of key related things that have come in through the chat on this. But one of the things we've seen across the country is local papers being bought by big corporate chains. And that has happened right here in our own community of Eugene. So Lisa, can you talk first of all a little bit about the effects of that on local coverage? Can we still consider a paper like the Eugene Register-Guard a local paper? And then second, you also talked about some of these new things that we're seeing in regard to local media, newsletters that are coming out. How are those items being funded?
Sure. So I'll talk first about sort of the big corporate chains. I think there's two really damaging things that are happening there. The first is much more sort of structural, which is that a lot of times these organizations that are buying up all these newspapers, they're not in the business of providing news to people who need it. They're in the business of making as much money as possible with as few expenses as possible. And that's just not a calculation that is going to work out in favor of a community, because that's when you get sort of newspapers in name only, right? Or these ghost newspapers where, yeah, they're providing coverage, but it's three journalists who are working around the clock, absolutely burning the candle at both ends to do an impossible job of covering an entire large community. And then they get laid off because they don't meet the bottom line. So you're seeing these organizations, again, who are not in the business of providing news. And then you're also seeing sort of these cost-saving measures that are trying to sort of make efficiencies within sort of the journalism process, where, you know, they do one big story and then that goes out to all the communities, or they've got editors all in one place who are editing all of the content from all of the communities. And that makes sense on paper, but it doesn't make sense in practice, because each community is unique and it's got sort of things about it that you need to know if you're going to serve that community with information. We had an example here in Eugene a while ago where there was a story that was a very interesting investigative story, but it just didn't, the sort of place it was coming from just didn't fit the ethos of this community. And so right away, people were just like, wait, what? And it didn't land at all. And in fact, people were offended. And, you know, there was nothing particularly wrong with the story. It just was a bad fit for this community. So those are, I think, two of the main things you're seeing. And then your question about sort of how these, for example, newsletters are being funded, you know, it's tough. There's a new sort of newsletter platform that, you know, is set up so that you can charge, you know, a subscription for it. And a lot of people are using that. Substack. A lot of people are using that because it's sort of built for folks who are producing this sort of information and would like to make a little money on it, rather than just sort of, you know, doing it for sort of civic duty. But, you know, that's a long, hard road, and it starts to become sort of a business issue, right? Where it's no problem on the content front. You've got a good, hardworking, smart person who's gathering information responsibly for a public good, but they don't really know about how, you know, how a business works, or all of these things you need to take into account. And so that's one of the spaces that I'm working in now, is trying to help those folks really understand the structure that they need to put into place to get their great stuff out to people.
And I would argue, and I know we're running out of time here, but I mean, one of the challenges with the kind of the asset stripping venture capitalist approach that we're seeing in many communities is that we're still often talking about, well, what does the commercial model look like for local news? And that may just be redundant. I think there's a lot more excitement around non-profit, community-owned journalism and news for the public good. And that's a space that I'm really excited about.
Absolutely. So our final question for the evening, this will give each of you a chance to give your thoughts on this question, as well as any sort of wrap up information that you want to share this evening. So we have a lot of student journalists in the audience this evening, and they're asking questions about, wow, maybe I should go in and cover a local community for a while as opposed to going to the big city. So what do you see, first of all, as the value of spending time in a perhaps more rural news organization? And second, how can you go in and effectively cover that community without parachuting, right? Without being seen as a parachute journalist. So let's come first to you, Todd.
Yeah, I mean, I think local news is the beating heart of journalism. And my first experiences as a reporter, you know, those were at a local newspaper in Modesto, California, covering a, you know, by California standards, a really rural and agricultural area. And I think the experience you get at some of those places is so broad, so sort of mind-opening, that it's just a wonderful training ground. And so I would encourage students to really seek out those opportunities. You get to do a lot of different things and in a way that I think is really rewarding. But I think to avoid, the way to do it right and avoid what you're talking about, you know, like parachuting in, is to be an active listener. I think that's all journalism starts with. And I think even the pathway to answering a lot of the business questions that Lisa is raising here begins with listening and understanding what are the authentic community information needs of this community, and how can I as a journalist best serve those.
Damien?
I would echo everything that Todd has said. I mean, this is a space where you can have real impact and you can really see the value of your work very quickly in terms of making a difference in the community, in terms of the relationships that you can build and transferable skills that will stand you in good stead at any outlet, large or small. I think the other thing I would say to your point about parachuting is to be truly invested in that community. So you're not just reporting on it, you are living in it. So you are, at some of those community meetings, or you're at the farmers market or other things, not just as a reporter, but as a human being, as a member of that community. And I think being present in that way is a really good way, not only to build trust, but also to generate and create access and other opportunities that down the line you can parlay into the kind of work that you are doing. But it is about being genuine, about being open and accessible, and as everyone has said, listening.
I'll quickly add that I think it's really important for folks to really think about what is your definition of success, right? I think there's one definition of success that has been beaten into a lot of folks' heads over and over again, and that is one definition, right? So if your definition of success is to live sort of a rich life in a community where you are invested and entrenched and you've got sort of a stake in that and folks have stake in you and it's affordable and you can sort of have a life that you want to, that may not be the one that you see sort of in the movies or things like that, but is incredibly rich. I think that's a lesson that I've certainly learned is what is success? What does it really mean to have a meaningful life? And I think that that's a pretty cool thing to think about.
Well, thank you to our panelists this evening for another enlightening discussion. And thank you to those of you in the audience for joining us this evening. And we hope that you learned a lot. And we appreciate you taking part in this webinar. We have one final panel that we will host 2 weeks from tonight. So our final panel will be on November 9th. And so that will give us a chance to talk about what actually happens in the next 2 weeks leading up to the election and then the week after the election itself. So we hope you will join us in 2 more weeks for our final installment of this webinar series. Thank you and good night.